Welcome back, everybody. Before we start, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss out on future episodes. Today, we're diving into something that sounds a bit scary at first. A 10% tariff on everything coming from China. But get this, the market actually reacted with relief to this.
Yeah, that's right. Usually a tariff announcement would spook the markets, but here it was like everybody was breathing a sigh of relief.
Why would a 10% tariff cause relief? What were people so worried about?
A much bigger trade war was the real fear. There were serious concerns about tariffs on goods from Canada and Mexico, too.
Oh yeah, I remember those rumors. It felt like at times tariffs on Canada and Mexico were almost a sure thing.
For sure. Compared to that, a targeted tariff on Chinese goods felt almost like the best case scenario.
Okay, so let's break down how China responded. How did they retaliate?
China's response was very strategic and calculated. They announced tariffs on specific U.S. goods like coal, LNG, crude oil farm equipment, and some autos.
So they went with a targeted approach instead of a broad sweeping tariff.
Exactly. And there are two important details about their retaliation. First, the rates are lower than what the U.S. imposed. 15% on coal and LNG and 10% on the other goods. Second, they built in a delay. These tariffs don't go into effect until February 10th.
That delay is interesting. It feels like they're leaving room for more negotiation.
Could be a sign they're hoping to de-escalate and find a solution that works better for both sides.
What about the financial impact of China's response? How big of a deal is it?
The estimated impact is less than $30 billion worth of goods affected. That's a lot less than what a lot of people were afraid of.
So it seems like both sides are trying to avoid an all-out trade war, for now at least.
Yeah, there's definitely a sense that both the U.S. and China are working to keep things contained and prevent this from getting completely out of control.
Let's move on to the market reaction. We talked about the initial relief, but are there still concerns about those possible tariffs on Canada and Mexico?
Well, there are definitely still some concerns, but the general feeling is that Canada and Mexico probably won't be the main targets in this trade war, especially Canada.
Why is that? What makes Canada less likely to be a target?
It seems like the focus of the current administration is really on border enforcement, and that's where the problems with Mexico come from. Canada doesn't really fit into that as much.
So Canada and Mexico are kind of tied up with bigger political issues. And with that 30-day delay on tariffs for those countries, there's still time for things to change.
That's right. We could see more negotiations, adjustments, or even a whole different strategy during that time.
Okay, we've talked about the market's relief and China's strategic response, but what about the economic impact of these tariffs on China? Are there any predictions on how this might affect things?
Well, there have been some estimates. The projections suggest a potential drag on China's economic growth of about 0.14%. And there's an expected boost to inflation, too, around 1.12% because of these tariffs.
Those numbers don't sound too bad. Are we talking about a big impact here?
You have to put those numbers in perspective. Compared to what could have happened with tariffs on Canada and Mexico, the current situation looks much less serious.
Just so we're clear, what kind of impact were we looking at if tariffs had hit Canada and Mexico?
Oh, the estimates for that were way worse. We were potentially talking a 1% hit to GDP and a 0.66% jump in inflation. So yeah, the situation with the China tariffs definitely feels lighter economically speaking.
So even with all this trade tension and tariffs going on, the overall outlook for the U.S. economy is still pretty positive.
Seems to be the general feeling, yeah. The projections are still pointing to above-trend GDP growth, like around 2.2%, and inflation staying pretty moderate at about 2.3% for the year.
It's pretty optimistic considering everything. What's behind that positive outlook?
Well, a lot of analysts see these tariffs as a strategic tool, a way to put pressure on other countries and gain an advantage in trade talks. They think it's all part of a bigger plan, not a sign that the economy is going to tank.
But are they ruling out the possibility of things escalating down the line?
Not really. Things could definitely heat up later in 2025, especially if more revenue becomes a pressing need.
So this trade tension could flare up again later in the year. Definitely something to watch as we move forward.
For sure. It's a situation that needs to be monitored closely. Global trade is always changing, and it's important to stay up to date on any potential shifts.
Now let's focus specifically on the tariffs on China. Are those likely to be lifted anytime soon, or are we looking at something more long-term?
It's doubtful they'll be lifted in the near future. The thinking is that these tariffs are part of a broader strategy to address long-standing trade imbalances and issues.
So the trade relationship with China is still a bit tense and uncertain.
Yeah.
Seems like we're far from a resolution here.
Yeah, and it's a situation that will probably keep changing in the coming months. The outcome of these trade talks and the long-term impact of these tariffs are still up in the air. It's a complicated situation with a lot of moving parts.
Sounds like we'll need to keep an eye on how all this develops.
Absolutely. This is just one part of a much bigger story. We have to remember these tariffs on China aren't happening out of the blue. They're part of a bigger picture, a complex web of global politics and economics.
So it's more than just trade deficits and economic rivalry?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. We're talking global influence, tech dominance, the whole future balance of power in the 21st century. It's like the U.S. and China are playing a game of chess, and these tariffs are just one move.
What are some of the other pieces on the board, so to speak? What else is shaping this complicated relationship between the U.S. and China?
Well, there are a few key issues. Intellectual property rights have been a big problem for years. The U.S. says China's engaging in unfair trade practices, like stealing intellectual property from American companies.
We've definitely heard a lot about that lately. Seems like it's become a major sticking point.
And then there's China's growing military, especially in the South China Sea. That's making not just the U.S., but also China's neighbors in the region pretty nervous.
These are definitely big issues that go way beyond just trade. It feels like the U.S.-China relationship is getting more and more complex and layered.
It's a relationship that's super interconnected, but also increasingly tense. These tariffs are like a symptom of that underlying tension, a way for both sides to try and get what they want and protect their own interests.
Let's bring this back down to earth for a second. How do these tariffs, these trade wars, actually affect regular people?
Well, the impact of tariffs can be felt in a few ways. For shoppers, it could mean higher prices on some things. For businesses that rely on imports from China, they might have to pay more, which could lead to people losing jobs or less investment. And the whole economy might grow more slowly because there's less trade happening.
So we're talking potential direct and indirect consequences. It's not just some abstract numbers. It's about real impacts on people's jobs, their bank accounts, their whole financial well-being.
Exactly. And just how big those consequences are depends on a bunch of things, like how long the tariffs last, what other countries do in response, and how well businesses and consumers can adapt.
Sounds like there's a lot of uncertainty about the long-term impact of these tariffs. How can people deal with that uncertainty? What can they do to protect themselves?
Staying informed is key. It's important to follow the news, keep up with what's happening in the trade talks, and really understand how different policy choices could affect the economy and financial markets.
So knowledge is power in this situation. The more people know, the better decisions they can make with their money.
Definitely. The more you understand about all this, the better prepared you'll be if things get rough. And it's important to remember trade disputes aren't just about economics. They have a big political side too.
Right, trade policy is often used as a tool to achieve political goals and put pressure on other countries. It's one way countries try to shape the global scene and get what they want.
Exactly. It's a really complicated issue that requires a nuanced understanding, and it's something that will probably keep shaping the world for years to come.
Sounds like we're in for a long and maybe bumpy ride when it comes to global trade and international relations.
Maybe, but it's also a ride that gives us chances to learn, grow, and adapt. It's a chance to challenge what we think we know and see the world in new ways.
It's a chance to really engage with how complicated globalization is and think critically about how to create a fairer, more equal global system.
For sure. And ultimately to help build a more sustainable and prosperous future for everyone.
That's a pretty inspiring thought. It reminds us that even with all these challenges, there's still hope for a better future.
It's a goal worth fighting for, and one that needs us to be actively involved.
So what can people do to contribute? How can we as everyday folks play a part in making a more just and equal world?
There are tons of ways to get involved. We can support groups working to make trade fairer. We can push for policies that put human rights and environmental sustainability first. We can learn about global trade ourselves and teach others. And we can be mindful of what we buy and which companies we support.
Those are all really practical and impactful things anyone can do. It reminds us that we all have a role to play in making a better future, even when these global problems feel too big to change.
Absolutely. Every little bit counts. It's about recognizing our collective power as consumers, as citizens, as global citizens, to really make a difference.
It's about realizing that our choices, our actions, our voices can create a ripple effect and help build a more just and sustainable world.
For sure. And by working together, we can make trade a force for good instead of something that causes conflict and division. We can build a world where everyone benefits, where human rights matter, and where we protect the environment.
That's a vision worth working towards.
Definitely. It's a vision that needs our collective wisdom, compassion, and courage.
And I believe we can achieve it if we work together. If we recognize how connected we are, our shared humanity, and our responsibility to create a better world for ourselves and for generations to come.
I agree. We have the potential to build a world where trade helps everyone, not just a few. And these conversations are a step in the right direction.
They really are. By talking openly and honestly, we can understand each other better, bridge gaps, and create a fairer world.
So let's keep these conversations going. Let's keep asking questions, considering different viewpoints, and working together to build a better future.
Absolutely. Let's face the challenges and opportunities ahead with a spirit of collaboration and hope.
Well said. I think we've covered a lot of ground today. It's really interesting how the markets reacted to this 10% tariff on all Chinese goods. It was almost like they were bracing for something way worse.
Yeah, it is kind of strange. The initial reaction was actually relief, which seems odd when you're talking about tariffs.
It really shows you how much anxiety and uncertainty there was before the announcement. People were seriously worried that the U.S. might go all out and slap tariffs on a bunch of different countries.
So compared to that fear, a targeted tariff on China felt more measured and controlled.
Exactly. Investors were relieved because it seemed like the U.S. was willing to negotiate strategically instead of just jumping into a huge trade war.
It sounds like the markets see these tariffs as a bargaining chip, a way for the U.S. to get leverage and change trade deals in their favor.
That's a good point. It reminds us that trade policy is never simple. It's always tied up with politics, economic strategy, even national security. These tariffs are a tool, a way to try and get concessions and achieve bigger goals.
It's a high-stakes game with a lot of strategy and risk, and you really have to understand the players, what they want, what's at stake for them, and what could happen with every move.
Definitely. It reminds us that we can't just take things at face value. We need to look deeper than the headlines, try to figure out what's really going on and what these actions could mean in the long run.
So as we wrap up our discussion today, what's the main takeaway? What should our listeners remember as they try to make sense of this complicated world of trade wars, tariffs, and market reactions?
I think if we connect this situation to the bigger global picture, the key takeaway is that trade policy is rarely just about economics. It's often deeply connected to politics, power dynamics, and even national security.
So it's not just about numbers and percentages and economic indicators. It's about influence. It's about strategy. And it's about who has power on the global stage.
Exactly. It's a game that's constantly changing with new players, new rules, and new challenges popping up all the time. It shows us that we need to stay informed, challenge what we think we know, and look for different perspectives.
Well said. This has been a really insightful conversation.
I've enjoyed our chat. It's always great to dive into these complex topics and explore different viewpoints.
I've learned a lot today, and I'm sure our listeners have too. Thanks for joining us, everyone. We'll be back next time to explore more fascinating and thought-provoking topics.
Until then, stay curious, stay informed, and keep those questions coming.